Good evening. Good evening to all of you. I wish I could see you there, but I know you're there. Anyway, I begin by thanking Marcia for that very nice introduction. Actually, Marcia and her husband Jeff and my wife Tina and I were introduced by our parents 30-some years ago when we were young adults because they wanted us to become friends for life, which we have. So it's very nice to be here and to have an introduction that comes from Marcia. This evening is going to be an evening about stories, about writing stories and telling stories. And so, sort of to put my introduction of Etgar in context, I'm going to tell you a few of my own stories. Of course, having to do with the Israel Museum, a not insignificant part of my own life. And you see in front of you an iconic image of the museum after its renewal 5 years ago, an image that I hope many of you are familiar with, an image that happens to have been taken at sunset on the summer solstice in June of 2011. And it's an image that is just very powerfully radiant of what the power of that setting is all about. My first story is actually about the first time that I saw the museum in April of 1996 when I was asked to go to Jerusalem for the first time to think about becoming director of the museum. I walked up the museum's Carter Promenade knowing nothing about the museum but feeling the power of that venue. And I'm showing you an image now which really gives you an understanding of the underlying foundational power of that place. This being an image on May 11th, 1965, when the museum was barely 10% of the size that it is now, being the opening day of the museum, which 2 months from now will be the 50th anniversary of the museum. Now, keep that number 50 in your mind for a little bit because it's going to come up again. This next image, which is from July 2010, just after we finished the reinvention of the museum. It was a privilege and continues to be a privilege for me in my own time to have been part of realizing the potential of this place by bringing it closer and closer to what we think the original vision of the place was. Here you're seeing the outside of it, and what you see is the way in which it feels as it did in 1965, and yet 45 years later is something we hope greater and stronger. But it's not about what's outside, it's about what's inside this place. Those of you who've been there know that what's special about the museum is that on the one hand, it is very deeply rooted in its own local historical culture. At the same time, it's about putting that culture in a universal context and looking at it against the neutral modernist backdrop of what you see here. In a way, what we've done at the museum is counter-trend to what museums do elsewhere in the world. You know that we reinvented our entire place for a pretty modest sum, which was only $100 million. I think many of you who've been there know that without changing the scale of the museum, we doubled the galleries on the inside, and while doubling the space, we reduced the number of objects inside so that our story could be about showing the most beautiful and the most meaningful things, not showing simply the greatest number of things that we could fit inside our buildings. Mainly what the museum has come to be about is telling a narrative, telling stories, and you can think of that as one long story, or you can think of that as a series of short stories, which brings us closer to our evening together with Etgar. Today, as Marcia mentioned, we have almost 1 million visitors a year at the museum. That's not a big number if you think in terms of demographics here, but many of you know Israel, and you know that our demographics are markedly different. You know that we only have 700,000 people in Jerusalem, only 8 million people in all of Israel. Our tourist traffic in good years is 2.5 to 3 million tourists, so 1 million visitors is not a small number. We've had landmark shows in the last few years that the world has paid great attention to, not least among them the first exhibition to look at Hasidic cultures of the world, and the first exhibition to look at King Herod and the legacy of King Herod in the region. Interestingly, at the present moment, and we couldn't in a way be in a more complex moment in terms of Israel's relationship with much of the rest of the world, but at this very moment and within the last several months, we have inaugurated 9 showings of 7 museum exhibitions in 5 countries on 3 continents around the globe. It's pretty remarkable to have us spread so broadly across the landscape, given the climate in which we live. This next image brings you back to that number 50. It is indeed our 50th anniversary. I'm going to explain this logo for the year just because it gives you a sense of the way that we think about everything that we do. On the left, you see the logo of the museum that those of you who know and love us know to be our logo, designed by Willem Zonberg, the first director of the museum, in 1965. The 50 on the right is a very contemporary typography joined together with our logo. The confetti behind is 2 things. Our logo was actually just the logo and the 50. My wife, Tina, who has the best design eye that I know, said, it doesn't look very celebratory. It needs something celebratory. I happen to have cufflinks that were designed by George Jensen in 1965. Tina said, take the confetti from your cufflinks and make this celebratory. So that's what you see here, up there. And what you see there also is the reference to 50 years ago, to 1965, and when you come to the museum during this year, the year is actually all about 1965, what Israel looked like in 1965, what its aesthetic vocabulary was, and how that relates to that vocabulary today, and how if you go back 50 years from 1965, you understand the edgy avant-garde that was percolating in Europe before World War II and that came to Palestine before and during and after World War II and really became the foundational language, not just for Israel in its early years, but for the museum itself. Finally, an image that I just want to stay with us throughout the evening because it's an image with a story. It's Doug and Mike Starnes' big bamboo spread across the sculpture garden of the museum this past summer. Later, we'll talk about how this is a short story in itself. So let's hold that image while I move to Etgar Keret, our special guest for the evening. In a way, there's another story that introduces why Etgar is here with me this evening. In 2008, when Israel turned 60, we in the museum were asked to do an exhibition looking at art in Israel in the preceding decade, in the period from Israel's 50th anniversary to its 60th. It was called Real-Time Art in Israel Today. And I started to think then about the notion of this special group of not just visual artists, but creators in many different disciplines who were in their 30s when Israel turned 50, and who were in their 40s when Israel was turning 60 in 2008. And we started to realize in the museum that there was something special about this group of creative individuals that were emerging at that time. In a way, they were a bit disconnected from the weight of the history of the founding of the state. They could be a little less serious. They could be a little more humorous. And in a way, that separated them from artists of what you might call a first generation of creators in Israel. And at the same time, they continued to carry. That is, they didn't shed the eccentricity of their personal family histories, being only 2 or 3 generations in the region, having come before, during, or after the trauma of World War II. As part of what happened in the 60th anniversary year, I was asked to put together a conference panel on the subject of Israel's arts in Israel and outside of Israel. I brought together 4 practitioners that I didn't know particularly well at that time: Sigalit Landau for the visual arts, Achinoam Nini for the performing arts, Joseph Cedar for cinema, and Etgar Keret for literature. There was a remarkable confluence of traits among those 4 practitioners. They were all very internationalized in many ways, but unlike artists from all other countries that had started moving around the world, they were not homogenized. They were out in the world, but they had not lost the particular characteristics that also identified them as Israeli. All of them were born after 1965, that is, after the year that the museum was founded. They are all now heading toward the age of 50. Etgar was born in 1967. When I mentioned this to him the other day, he started to look a little bit nervous. He said, "I'm not nearly 50. I said, "Not to worry, 50 is the new 30. I don't think that helped him relax. In any case, Etgar is a master of the short story. He's had 5 collections published thus far. Even more importantly, those collections have been translated into 37 languages and absorbed all over the world. And Etgar writes in a very Israeli kind of Hebrew, but it's a language which is translated worldwide. It's not been homogenized, it's not lost its Israeliness, but it's interesting to think how the world has absorbed it, how the world has taken it up. You see his stories frequently in the New Yorker, in the New York Times. You can hear his stories read on National Public Radio. He also makes films, and I hope that you've all had the privilege of seeing his 2007 film, Jellyfish, which he did together with his wife, Shira Geffen. He is about to publish his next book, which is not a collection of short stories, rather a memoir called 7 Good Years, which will be coming out this coming summer. All of his writing has these qualities of being local and eccentric, while also being embraced by the rest of the world, and this is something very important in understanding what his work is all about. We in our museum have a kind of mantra, which is that all things connect across time and geography. After reading a great many of Etgar's stories, I have a feeling that his stories are, in a way, about how all things connect across fact and fiction. In realizing that and in thinking about our own mantra, it was very easy for me to feel a kind of instant connection between myself and Etgar. He's become a great friend, and with that, I'm delighted to ask him to come out here and to join me at the table here so that we can chat in front of all of you. I hadn't thought about this very much until I started reading your work as much as I do now, and there is this thing about what is fact and what is fiction. And even when you spoke about the story that I think is supposed to be fact, it sounds like it's fiction. And is it because you're a writer that you see in fact fiction? Or is it that there's something, when I talk about the eccentricity of the lives of your generation, is this something that's there that makes things that happen to you actually seem as if they're fiction? I want you to talk about how your parents met and how you met Shira. I just want you to tell those 2 stories. Those 2 pieces of factual history.
Oh, I will, but if you would talk about strange, unbelievable stories, I think it's just enough to introduce my family because because my parents are both Holocaust survivors, but I have 2 siblings.
You're not going to believe this.
The eldest is my brother, who had started the legalized marijuana movement that had run for parliament, and he's in the anti-Zionist left, and he had left Israel with his wife 10 years ago. They moved to Thailand, where he continues his social activism from a tree house with high-speed internet. And
I told you, you won't believe this.
And my sister, she's an ultra-Orthodox, and just 2 nights ago, her 13th grandchild was born, and she's 52, so.
I was going to say, is she 50 yet?
And so I think that what I can say something about my childhood, that I think that both my parents didn't have a normal childhood, and not having a normal childhood. Like my mother always said that the entire idea of parenthood was kind of basically looking at your own childhood, and if it was a good one, you would imitate your parents, and if it was a bad one, you would do the opposite. And she said, since I got orphaned in such an early age, I have no reference. I have to improvise, you know, and I think that both my mother and my father, they did all kinds of stuff that wouldn't be recommended, you know, by a child psychologist, but somehow it worked. It's like, you know, it's like, you know, the entire idea was that they loved us a lot and they did whatever seemed like a good idea. Actually, I know that you want me to tell another story, but I, you want me? Okay, I can tell.
No, continue this one, and then I'll remind you to tell the other one.
So a story, you know, many times like when I come and I'm on stage, they always ask you who's the writer who had influenced you the most, you know, and I always talk about Kafka and Bashevis Singer because they were the writers who influenced me the most. But the truth is that I always kind of have this kind of urge to correct the question so I can answer it differently and say who is the storyteller who had influenced you the most. And in a strange way, it was my father, because who could never make up any story. You know, he could just tell you what happened to him, and it would sound amazing when he would tell that. You know, that he went to the grocery store and he bought, you know, a carton of milk, and it would sound like Star Wars, you know, and the thing was that my mother, since she had very vivid memories of her parents telling her bedtime stories, she had these traditions that every night they would tell us a bedtime story, like mostly my mother would, and that they would not read it from books, because when she was in the ghetto, there was no access to books, so her parents had to make up the stories. And for her, like, reading a story from a book was like kind of ordering a pizza for dinner. It's like what a lazy parent does. You know, you buy a book and you read, like, you know. A good parent, like, prepares a fresh story each night, you know. And it was very easy for her. She has an amazing imagination, so she could make up those stories. But sometimes she couldn't tell us the story, and then she would send my dad, who couldn't make up anything, you know. And he would tell us those true stories, like he would never introduce them as true, but when somebody tells you a story and you see that he's not making it up, he's just like saying, no, his name wasn't Moshe, his name was, it was Avram. Like, you see that he kind of recollects it. And all these stories were amazing, and the most powerful thing about them is that they had something completely non-judgmental about them. Like, all the characters, you loved all the characters, even though they would do horrible things, and you would empathize with them. And they were like, you know, they were like Hasidic tales in displays of their human love. And they all had one thing in common. They all took place in a whorehouse. And the protagonists were always drunk people and prostitutes. And at the age of 5, I asked my father, what's a prostitute? And he said, well, a prostitute is somebody whose profession is to listen to other people's troubles. So I said, wow, okay. And what's drunk person? He said, it's those people who they have these kind of physical conditions that the more liquid they drink, the happier they become. So it was at that stage that I decided that when I grew up, I want to become a drunk male prostitute, you know?
And that's about Jews in the diaspora. And if you go back to what I said in the beginning about this thing, which seems to be special in this generation about Israeli Jewish creators in different disciplines, because they have the ability to be very local and very eccentric, and yet to appeal, in your case, to 37 languages around the world. And why is that the case?
Well, I actually think that let's say, when you do work of art, there are like different levels in which you can zoom in to the picture. So let's say if you read Dickens, you know, then he tells you a story of a city, you know, or a neighborhood, or, you know, or if you see The Wire, you know, on TVs, and it tells you something in this kind of resolution, and you can zoom in more and more and more and more. And if you zoom in and become a particularly specific, then at some stage you become universal. You know, because you don't talk about a social structure, you talk about a thought, you talk about emotion, and when you do that, then everybody can get it.
The more local you become, the more universal it is absorbed. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I have a story called the Bus Driver Who Wanted to Be God, which is a story that is very much kind of inspired by the Hasidic tales my sister would share with me because she's a Breslover, so her rabbi wrote great tales, and I started writing those agnostic Hasidic tales. It's like they're just like Hasidic tales, but I kind of remove God from the picture, and many times I would travel overseas, let's say, and I would have an event in Oslo, and after the event, like, two elderly ladies would come to me and say, we gotta know, like, is this story about this driver with the mustache from the 7 line in Oslo, the one, and you could go to Korea and they would talk to you about a Korean bus driver, and then you say, like, if there's something about some kind of human behavior in a certain condition, people can understand it wherever you go.
But there is something special in this current generation of creativity from Israel that preserves the thing that is local and unique, whereas in many other countries, creators in different disciplines are becoming very similar. There's this homogeneity that is destroying the ability to be local at the same time that you are absorbed globally.
But I think that the localness in Israel, it has stronger flavors. It's like, I look at my son's childhood. He's 9 years old, and he lives in a kind of a very kind of intellectual and Western environment, going to the opera and stuff. But at the age of 9, he had already experienced 2 wars and knows how to deal with missile attacks, but at the same time, has cool project to write about peace and to draw little doves in his notebook. I think that there's something about that is pretty unique. Like, maybe it's kind of existentially, it's a stronger difference than you can find between a French boy and an Italian boy.
I think you're right. So this is how fact becomes fiction. It's through the quality of the storytelling. Now you have to tell us the other story about how you and Shira met.
So me and my wife were together for 17 years, and I knew her a little bit because she had a small role in the first short movie I've directed. And I was invited to some party, which was a very loud party in a club, and I drank a little bit, and it was very noisy, and I wanted to go home. And when I was about to leave, she entered, and we were talking, and you have to shout because it's very, very noisy. And she said to me, "Are you staying?" And I said, "No, actually, I'm going." And she said to me, "Kiss me." And I was very much surprised because nobody ever said that to me, except for my mother, But suddenly this beautiful and smart woman asks you to kiss her, but still there were many people, and I didn't know what to do. So I said to her, "How about we go somewhere and have a coffee and talk?" And she said, "Okay," and we talked, and then I walked her home, and then we started dating. And when we were together, I said to her, what the first thing that kind of got me close to you? And she said, "What?" And I said, "It was your courage, because we didn't know each other. And then you said to me, 'Kiss me.'" I said, No, I said, "You'll never get a taxi."
Now, I just want to ask all of you, does this sound like fact or does it sound like fiction? You couldn't have written this. Or maybe it's not whether or not you could have written it, it really is about how you tell it. And how you tell it is very magical.
Thank you. It's I think it says something about the way I experience reality. Like something happened, and I imagine that something else had happened.
Actually, I've thought about, having heard this story before, I've thought about this in the past, and I've thought, I wonder if actually she didn't simply say, "Kiss me."
And then...
And you imagine the other.
Yeah, oh yeah, that she didn't, yeah, but I try to think, like I didn't try to think before, but I'm trying to think now, that basically when you tell the stories of how you met your partner, then you're saying something about the nature of your relationship, you know? So, you know, that like with my father and mother, it's very true that my father was kind of like irresponsible and almost kind of lawless, and that in a way that this is what charmed my mother, you know, to be with him, and with me, I guess that I have a bad hearing, and my wife is a compassionate woman, so.
From your perspective, what is the story of Israel?
Well, the story of Israel. Well, first of all, like you
You
know.
can go back to Egypt. You were just there.
No, so I think, you know, it all goes down to the difference between Israel and America, because in the U.S. when you publish a good book, you base a movie on it, you know, like you make a movie out of it. And in Israel, when a Jew writes a good book, we build a country based on it, you know. So so it's really, I really think that, you know, there's something about Israel that it's really, I don't know any other country that is based on an idea, you know. I think this is a very Jewish kind of thinking, you know, that we have a concept and then we just say, you know what, like, I mean, what happened, like, countries are tribes that lived in this area for many years, but with the Jewish state, you know, people said, we have a great idea, we just don't know if we put it in Tasmania, Uganda, or the Middle East. You know, we already have the concept, you know, we just need the real estate, you know, so it's a very unique kind of story that you cannot find any other country who's like that.
I can't claim to be a fluent Hebrew reader, but being a fluent Hebrew reader, your Hebrew is very colloquial. And so it really carries locally, and it's interesting to think how it gets translated and absorbed in so many other languages in the same way that it is in Hebrew.
Well, I don't think.
Or is that not the case?
Yeah, it's not the case. Well, first of all, I must say that, you know, that when I started writing in colloquial speech, there was a lot of resistance because people like traditionally who write in Hebrew, you know, Hebrew is. I always say that, you know, that when you're a writer and you write, you look at your bookshelf and there is a book that intimidates you. Like if you write in English, you see Shakespeare there, you know. If you write in Italy, you see Dante. And with all my respect to Shakespeare and Dante, you know, when you look at the Bible, you know, it didn't only outsell, you know, Shakespeare and Dante, but the guy who supposedly wrote it did a couple other things, like, you know, so he was creative, a multidisciplinary creative guy.
Even though he didn't exist.
Even though, and he didn't exist in the same time. And he never gave an interview to the New York Times, you know, he was modest too, you know, so there is this thing about Hebrew being a holy language and a language that wasn't spoken for many years for its holiness, that the moment that you write in Hebrew, you automatically raise the register, you know. So writing colloquial speech is not something that is very common in the Israeli tradition, but growing up on Yiddish storytellers and Yiddish being a very oral kind of language, then I always had a passion for colloquial speech. And again, after being attacked for so many times for writing in colloquial speech, then out of like just my defense mechanism, I built a theory why it's important that I write in colloquial speech. But I must say that first they attacked me, and then only then I came up with a theory. And what I think is that the Israeli colloquial speech is unlike any other colloquial speech in the world, for the fact that, you know, that again, you know, if you tell the story of the Hebrew language, when I talk to kids, I always say just like Captain America, okay? You have a language, it's frozen for 2,000 years. People know how to read it, but they don't use it. And then one arbitrary day, they put it in the microwave of history. They defrost it, and everybody starts speaking Hebrew again, and you have this kind of amazing effect because unlike, let's say, English that had changed through all those years, you know, so if Shakespeare would enter the room and listen to us speaking, he wouldn't understand much, and not only because of my heavy accent, just because we use different vocabulary and different grammar. But if Abraham would enter a taxi cab in Jerusalem, he could communicate easily with the driver because the language kind of stayed the same. But the people who had started speaking that language, they had like 2,000 years worth of words that were not introduced to the language, you know. So I'm not talking about cars, you know. I'm talking about water taps. I'm talking about all those kind of things that you didn't have words for them in the Bible. And when people, the thing about colloquial speech, when you speak, you need something. So it's not about saying it right, it's about getting it. So what happened is that the average Hebrew sentence, you would have like, it's like 60% biblical, 8% Arabic, you know, 7% Russian, 3% English, and another 4% of stuff that you just made up.
And all those sophisticated Hebrew words like sveder, sandwich, and whiskey.
And yeah, you have to say it with no, you know, the examples that I like to give the most for a typical Hebrew sentence, you know, is this sentence tov yalla bye. Whenever like two Israelis say goodbye to each other, they say tov yalla bye. Okay, so tov is not only a biblical word, but it's from the first chapter in the Bible, Vayar Elohim ki tov, and God saw it was good, you know. Yalla is basically vamos in Arabic, and and bye it's in English, so you should know what it means. So when people say that, they think they speak Hebrew, and when you write in such a colloquial speech, then basically, unlike other colloquial speeches that are basically in a low register, here what you do in Hebrew, you have biblical word, Arabic word, biblical word, you know, English word. So basically, it's a kind of a roller coaster ride between registers, and that's why when they translate my work, then usually when I talk to my translators, they will say, okay, I read the story, I think I got it up or down, which means should we raise all the register up or should we take it down? But you cannot do this. Like, I mean, my metaphor for Hebrew colloquial speech is like if you take somebody who speaks in English, and it's like half of the word is using a King James Bible, the other half is like a Kanye West rap song, you know.
Right.
And
yes,
somehow this is how people buy stuff in the supermarket, you know, using this kind of weird language.
Do you want to translate my favorite phrase, full gas beneutral?
Full gas, yeah. Full gas, yeah. Yeah, it's like all of it, it's like Latin words, but should I explain the meaning?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a full gas, it's like when you press the gas pedal all the way down. And neutral is when your car transmission is in neutral, so you put a lot of fuel, but nothing really happens, right? And
this is Hebrew, but you can use it now. Great, thank you. Etgar.
Oh, thank you, James.
A great pleasure to do this with you.
Yeah.